Peace, love, and life, family. It's your girl, Morgan Renee Myers, tuning in for another reading of For Freedom's Sake, The Life of Fannie Lou Hamer by Chana Lee. Today is the 4th of July, and it is another day for me, but I felt that it was a great day to read, plus I got some time today, and we needed to get to the next chapter, so here we are. But I thought today was very fitting because people of color in America and the world over were not free on July 4th. Yeah, so I got on I'm supporting all local black business. So I cannot remember the sister or where I got this shirt from. I was somewhere at a vending event. Can y'all really see? It says Know Thyself with Africa in the middle. So I got it from some sister selling shirts there. I just got these earrings a few weekends ago in Reedsville. My brother Q White was selling these on his table, so I got these looking nice. And my sister Kalaine did my hair. Check that out. Yes, she did. She retwisted it and styled it for me so I could look good, you know. And I put the cowrie shells in. I put them on the ends. And so when she did it up, this is how it looked. But anywho, we're going to hop into this book. So we are on chapter 4. I know the last chapter was kind of rough for me because I was getting triggered. And this was actually, I read it like a little bit before Juneteenth, which is the day that slaves were emancipated in 1865, June 19th. So, but I was not feeling it this year. Like I was like, you know, we still not free with everything that's going on in the world. The George Floyds and Breonna Taylors and just everything that was going on. I wasn't really feeling Juneteenth this year, but prior to feeling that way, I was reading this book, and it was just talking about Fannie Lou's experience, about how her and some civil rights workers were going to register to vote or whatever they were doing, but they were going back from whence they came, and had an altercation with some police, and they were jailed and beaten, and yeah, and it was not good, and it really triggered me the way she describes how some of them were dealt with. Hey, peace, Brother David. So we're on chapter 4 now, and it is entitled Local Need and Electoral Politics. So it starts off with a quote. It says, "I've been so hungry staying at a white man's place that when I did get something to eat, I had to eat it gradually." A starving Mississippian, 1964. "The best way to stop niggers from voting is to visit them the night before the election." Theodore G. Bilbo, Mississippi Senator, 1946. So, a lot of these instances that she pointed out about how they were just trying to go vote earlier in the book. Now, this is a biography, meaning that someone else wrote it about Fannie's life. Fannie did not. She does have an autobiography, but that's not what I'm reading. So the author recalled instances earlier where when she first started getting involved in the civil rights movement and going to even register to vote, that she was met with much harassment, to the point that when she first attempted to register to vote, by the time she came back she lived on a plantation because they were sharecroppers, because prior to that, their family was slaves. So enslaved. So she was asked to leave the plantation. Her husband was told not to leave, or else he wouldn't have a job because he worked on the land. He wouldn't have a job, and they wouldn't have furniture because apparently they supplied all the furniture and whatnot. Peace, Brother John Snow. So she had to leave, and then her husband eventually did get another place to stay, and they was cutting off her water and trying to make like she didn't pay, and it was just all kind of harassment for the basic right, and it was legal at this time. She could go and register, but you know how Jim Crow laws and all that was going. So anyways, Local Need and Electoral Politics, chapter 4. After Winona, which is where the incident happened where they got beat by the cops, Hamer made repeated attempts to enter national politics. So it did not stop her. Sister kept going. Her life was being threatened. Like, this is crazy. That beating like ended up being one of the reasons I think she lost eyesight in one eye and like had a punctured organ or some sort. It's crazy. Okay. So after Winona, Hamer made repeated attempts to international politics. Electoral politics was a means to an end for Hamer. She believed that conscientious use of the vote could be an efficient and near-sure way to meet local needs. Although she valued the symbolic resistance that office seeking represented, ultimately she wanted nothing short of real change. The emphasis in office holding marked a new stage in in her young activist career. In 1962, Hamer had envisioned voting as a way to remove wealthy, racist politicians from office. By 1964, she saw the vote not only as a way to depose Mississippi's old guard, but also as a means of installing herself and others as viable alternatives despite their lack of experience. Peace, Sister Sharon. How you doing, boo? In issuing her personal challenge to Mississippi's established politicos, Hamer let it be known that the civil rights struggle was as much a battle for black equality as it was a fight to determine the future course of the state. Even though Hamer despised all that was brutal and unjust about Mississippi, she claimed it was my state as a birthright and as a product of her physical labor. That's how I feel about North Carolina. Like, we know all kind of stuff been done up and through here, but it's like, I do love Greensboro. I do love the state. I love how we got everything. We got mountains, we got cities, we got beaches, we got, country. Like, it's really versatile. It's a great place to live and raise children, I feel, even with all its history, So she felt like this was my state as a birthright and as a product of her physical labor. This was the broader vision of social change that she and SNCC brought to the movement. More than making life better for black people, the civil rights struggle was to save America. While Hamer failed at all of her attempts to win elective office during her career, she did gain national recognition for herself and for her state, primarily because her passionate public presentations show her to be an authentic representative of those who were seemingly most affected by American racism and poverty. Ironically, becoming a national figure required that Hamer build a local following. First 7 months of 1964, she strengthened her grassroots supports by directing a local food and clothing drive, encouraging voter registration, running for political office, and serving as a spiritual force for what became known as the Mississippi Freedom Summer Campaign of 1964. These contributions were important steps in Hamer's rise to national prominence. She acquired valuable organizing skill for large projects while undergoing on-the-job training in crisis management. In return, she taught courage, resilience, and endurance through example. She consequently received unwavering support from her fellow Deltons and other activists. In addition, through it all, the racial inequities of her home state gradually received much needed federal attention. All of these steps proved necessary before Hamer could play a role in the ill-fated challenge of the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, the event that ultimately gave her a place in history. For Fannie Lou Hamer, the year 1964 proved to be as politically eventful as 1962 and 1963 were spiritually trying and physically life-threatening. It started with Hamer's local movement work. For COFO and especially SNCC, Hamer was the all-important local leader. She was a key contact person, a source of information on the community. In a January 1964 field report, an unidentified SNCC field secretary ordered someone to contact Mrs. Hamer and a lady that got fired from a school in Ruleville. Tell Mrs. Hamer that she will tell you the name of the other lady, Mrs. Clark. Okay, this is written kind of weird. Hamer's pivotal role as a civil rights movement center woman proved vital to SNCC's local activities. Nowhere in this aspect of Hamer's relationship role more evident than in her food and clothing distribution efforts for SNCC through the Council of Federated Organizations, which is what COFO stands for, Council of Federated Organization. In Mississippi, SNCC's civil rights movement contributions included more than voter registration efforts. There were many aspects to the organization's work. Among them is food and clothing distribution to local poor folk. In the Mississippi Delta, Hamer played a central role in this little-known and rarely discussed aspect of movement activity. For Hamer, a movement had little meaning or relevance if it did not address the everyday needs of the people. It made little sense to recruit the disenfranchised to go into a courthouse and register to vote when they were worried about eating or having shoes to wear. I agree. While most black Deltans were without any political say-so, they were also without the very basic necessities, food and clothing. In comparison to their white farming counterparts, blacks were clearly at a disadvantage. According to a 1964 United States Department of Agriculture report, black Deltan median income was $456 a year as compared to $968 for whites in the Delta. Black Deltans were poor even in comparison to other blacks statewide. The average black Mississippi income was $606, and the white statewide average was more than 3 times as much. So the average black Mississippi income was $606, and the white statewide average was more than 3 times as much at $2,030. Infant mortality figures also indicated a struggle for basic necessities. A black baby was twice as likely to die in infancy as was a white infant. Housing conditions also reflected need. In 1965, over 90% of black homes in rural Mississippi had no flush toilet, bathtub, or shower. Let me read that again. In 1965, my mama was born in 1966. She 53, 54? So this was less than 60 years ago. Wow. In 1965, over 90% of black homes in rural Mississippi, so in the country of Mississippi, had no flush toilet, bathtub, or shower. They had to do everything outside every season. Did they have wells? Did they have running water somewhere on the property? Wow. The practical side of need was hardly ever lost on Hamer. And I like that. You can't fight a movement and do what we need to do and get people to register to vote and go up in courthouses and you starving and you ain't got no proper shoes. This is a smart woman and movement that was needed. And it was community coming together, because if they was that poor, where was they really getting clothes from? Each other. Or somebody knew how to get access to fabric and could sew and was making clothes. The practical side of need was hardly ever lost on Hamer. Early in the movement, she embraced a spiritually based political perspective that might be described as moral pragmatism. The approach of moral pragmatism involved tending to whatever needed to be done, wherever it needed to be done, because that was only right. If there was a need in a community for food, clothing, or housing, the moral pragmatists in the civil rights movement directly addressed those needs alongside the task of tearing down the walls of Jim Crow. For moral pragmatists like Hamer, the most pressing community needs determined one's political agenda. Hamer addressed this need out of both community allegiance and Christian obligation. Moral pragmatism was politics according to exigent conditions and religious duty, nothing less, nothing more. With need as their guide, moral pragmatists keep their attention focused on conditions in their own communities. They were local in orientation. Let me highlight that word, moral pragmatic. Came up a few times. Okay. Moral pragmatism was politics according to exigent conditions and religious duty, nothing less, nothing more. With need as their guide, let me highlight that. With need as their guide, moral pragmatists keep their attention focused on conditions in their own community. They were localistic in orientation. While moral pragmatists were not opposed to organizing around a national agenda, their pragmatism influenced them to take care of business at home first. That is, these activists tended to privilege local matters over a general, less sharply focused national set of goals and strategies. By this definition, the local and rural scene was the center of attention for such activists, which often led to a clash of views with a more nationally focused leadership. Beginning in 1964, Hamer's local activities included organizing and overseeing food and clothing distribution for Ruralville as well as surrounding Delta areas. Churches, civic clubs, and trade unions sent food and clothing from as far as New York and Boston. Okay, that's nice. I was like, how they getting this stuff if they so poor? Great. Other movement organizations, for instance, the Southern Southern Conference Educational Fund in New Orleans solicited donations through their own network. Sometimes Hamer's home was a terminus for items shipped from the north. Donors sent packages to Hamer in care of other Louisville residents. Sometimes shipments included as much as 10,000 to 30,000 pounds of food. Goodness, that's wow, people sticking and working together. That's beautiful. This work was tiring. Yes, it is. Life of an organizer is very tiring. And often disappointing. Sometimes crowds around a distribution site, usually a home in the neighborhood, grew as large as 200, and distributors often ran out of clothing before all needs were met. More than a few SNCC field reporters contained messages from Hamer requesting more and more clothing. While food and clothing distribution showed a genuine concern for destitute Mississippians, Hamer and SNCC also saw this as a way of mobilizing citizens for voter registration. In March 1964, the group known as Boston Friends of SNCC donated 10,000 pounds of food, among other necessities, and 60 people responded by going down to the county courthouse and attempting to register. Shipments of food and voter registration were inextricably linked. The food, which was badly needed, attracted people who, after hearing a Hamer speech, often felt heartened enough to attempt registration. Hamer's day-to-day field work was a meaningful example to her community. She managed to remain in daily contact with local people even as she traveled far throughout her tenure in the movement. At times, Hamer had to be blunt about drawing the link between food and voter registration, and she found it necessary to confront her neighbors and peers. On one occasion, Hamer interrupted a Freedom School session and demanded that the participants go to Indianola unregistered. On another occasion, Hamer refused to give clothes and food to women who had lined up in her yard at 7 o'clock in the morning to receive commodities. She chided them for being a pack of them women who never even been once to Indianola to try and register to help themselves. She insisted that no one should receive assistance before they tried to help oneself. In her mind, it was only right and necessary that everyone attempt voter registration before receiving donations. Hamer reassured those women who feared losing their jobs or lives in the movement would take care of them no matter the consequences. Now, see, that's tough. That's like asking anybody to do that in today, just because you feel like they're already in need, they're already poor. You're saying that they should not get access to these things if they haven't even tried to help themselves going to register to vote. And she knows how her experience was going to register to vote. Like, they harassed her and followed the bus on the way back, pulled the bus over and everything, like, and made her leave her property when she got back. So it's like, why? I don't like that. Oh, man. But when you're very passionate about something and you feel like it'll help your people, or if I've been through it so you can do it, these are the steps we just got to do it. Maybe that's the standpoint she was taking. Wow. Okay, so let me go back up. So on another occasion, Hamer refused to give clothes and food to women who had lined up in her yard at 7 o'clock in the morning to receive commodities. She chided them for being a pack of them women who never even been once to Indianola to try and register to help themselves. She insisted that no one should receive assistance before one tried to help oneself. In her mind, it was only right and necessary that everyone attempt voter registration before receiving donations. Hamer reassured those women who feared losing their jobs or lives that the movement would take care of them no matter the consequences. She told them it was important that blacks keep pounding on that registrar's door. That morning, she announced that no food and no clothes was going to be distributed till all the cars come back from Indianola. She borrowed a car and with help from other drivers drove the women to Indianola. Hamer made sure that 30 women registered that morning. Wow. A little after 2 o'clock that afternoon, they returned to Louisville. In a spirited, impromptu speech, Hamer addressed a crowd gathered at her porch. She declared, "These 30 women know that the way we're going to change things here in the Delta, here in Mississippi, is by getting the vote. Folks up north want to help us free ourselves, and that's why they send these boxes." She then addressed the worries of those who feared non-certain economic reprisal. She had been there. Their apprehensions were well-founded. She reassured them, anybody who loses his job because he tries to register to vote is going to be helped. Hamer felt gratified and uplifted by the women's participation. She needed them, and they needed her to achieve social change. Hamer certainly had enormous faith in the vote as an instrument of change, but in her front porch speech, she probably exaggerated the transformative potential of 30 new Ruleville registrants. However, hyperbolic public appeals by movement activists were not uncommon. A great deal of community mobilizing depended on generating a euphoric sense of power and control over one's destiny. Just as there were those who attempted registration at the prodding of Hamer, there were also those who took the food and clothing and for whatever reason chose not to make the most of the opportunity. This small minority aside, most people were beginning to identify with Hamer and her work. While they may have been those who felt some kind of pressure or just obligation to Hamer or Northern donors to attempt registration, others believed that the food and clothing represented the beginning of even better times and that they should take that additional step and attempt registration. Food and clothing distribution, accompanied by Hamer's message of encouragement, often raised dashed hopes and revived languid spirits. Sometimes food and clothing distribution got out of hand, and local activists called in Hamer to call disorder. Mediation was another of her many local leadership roles. On April 22nd, 1964, Ruleville's mayor instigated a near mob scene in Ruleville. A huge shipment of clothing had arrived from Illinois, and organizers stored it at the Irene and Earl Johnson residence, the main Ruleville distribution site. In an effort to undermine the process, Mayor Charles Durow announced on the radio where the shipment could be found. He encouraged community folk to go and take whatever they could get. Although organizers planned distribution for later that day, this unauthorized bulletin caught distributors off guard. That afternoon, around 50 cars parked outside the Johnson residence, where a crowd of approximately 200 people quickly formed and began clamoring for clothing. The Johnsons immediately called Hamer and asked her what to do. Hamer called COFO headquarters in Jackson, and officials instructed her to go over and try to settle things. Upon her arrival, Hamer began one of her patented speeches. Its rhetorical style and tone bore Hamer's unique signature. Her words were pointed and authoritative as she waxed bold and indignant with the delivery of each sentence. Her objective was clear: restore order, recruit potential restraints, and reclaim what small semblance of self-determination her community had acquired through running its own relief program. First, she needed to set the record straight about the limits of Mayor Durow's authority. She told the crowd that the mayor had nothing to do with the operation, nor did he have the right to claim that he knew what was going on. Furthermore, he had no say-so over what black people could or could not do in general. Undaunted by a carload of whites that circled the Johnson house as she spoke, Hamer told the crowd not to be afraid of white people, not those in the car, not the mayor, nor anyone else. By the time she finished, she had effectively served notice that the food and clothing distribution program was not local white folks' business. Hamer then seized the opportunity to make a pitch for a voter registration attempt. She noted that if the group went down and registered to vote and was successful, then mayors like Durow would not be in business to create such disturbances and confusion among them. Finally, she addressed the immediate matter, the logistics of clothing distribution for that particular day. She instructed that the clothes be distributed in an orderly fashion and the work resumed without incident. Sis came in, let them know what's what. Y'all acting like some hooligans. Tone it down. There was some misinformation, but we not going to show out like this. Powerful. Yes, sis. Oftentimes, Hamer's own family members rely on the food and clothing drives, for their circumstances were hardly any better than those of the neighbors. For Hamer, it felt good having her own needs met, and there appeared to be little shame in accepting donations. On the other occasions, when the drive could not meet her personal needs, Hamer's slight disappointment was eased by the satisfaction she derived from making sure donations reached poor children. During one of her drives, Hamer observed, "The first long coat I ever had in my life came from the clothing drive. It's rather hard to find clothes for me because I wear a size 22 and a half, but the clothing drive is most important for the children. There are children out of school because they have no clothes." Wow. Wow. Like, kids were really poor. Like, I'm thinking back to when I read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and they would talk about how their shoes were so tattered they had to like wrap it in newspaper and do all kind of stuff, and that's why it was hard to go to school when it rained, because it just was unbearable on their clothes. Wow. Excuse me. Like her voter registration work, food and clothing distribution had its concomitant dangers. Concomitant? Ooh, excuse me. No matter where and how Hamer contributed to the movement. Let me highlight that word so I can go back and look it up. Concomitant dangers. I feel like that word means evident or inescapable. So like her voter registration work, food and clothing distribution had its concomitant dangers. No matter where and how Hamer contributed to the movement, police harassment surely followed. Of course it did. On January 10th, 1964, a local police officer approached Hamer and other volunteers. He inquired about the origin of the clothes, their employers, and who gave them permission to distribute. Hamer announced to the two officers that she worked for COFO. The officers then took one of the forms that recipients were required to sign and told Hamer that they would return soon. At other times, the harassment was anticipated and was suspected at the first sign of anything slightly out of the ordinary. In late June 1964, a field secretary reported packages that have been coming to Mrs. Hamer's place seem to have been opened. The obsession with Hamer's political activism by law enforcement, plantation owners, and local politicians resulted in a new concern for Hamer by early 1964. While Hamer's 1962 and 1963 acts of resistance were perceived as individual effortry that warranted individualized persecution, her post-1963 activities were greeted by white supremacists in Ruleville with a seemingly unparalleled urgency and thoroughness that targeted all who associated with Hamer. This was largely because her sphere of influence was widening locally, presumably beyond realms even imaginable to her detractors. It was not that her 1964 harassment was any less life-threatening in nature. It was just that by February 1964, not only was Hamer the target of relentless harassment, but those who associated with her were also coming under constant threat and informal surveillance by Mississippi authorities. In a very visible way, Hamer had become larger than her individual challenges and achievement. She was out and about in her community, making bold public appeals, distributing food and clothing, and registering disenfranchised citizens. This was a far cry from her relative low-profile days following the first Indianola registration attempt and her subsequent eviction and retreat to Tallahatchie. By early 1964, she was on a conspicuous quest to persuade others to see what she saw in the voting and office holding, an end to justice, end to injustice, freedom. She tried to make contagious her own burning desire for change. The measure of personal accomplishment for Hamer by this point was the degree to which her individual efforts and collective efforts became one and the same. Their racist assumptions of black inferiority notwithstanding, white supremacists in Ruleville could intuit enough to know that this only spelled trouble for their old way of life, and they responded accordingly. This new phase of harassment of Hamer and her supporters was focused equally on the food and clothing campaign and Hamer's decision to run for the 2nd Congressional District House of Representatives seat held by Jamie Whitten in early 1964. Whitten was an influential congressman who had held office since 1941. And this is in 1964? Wow. So over 20 years. Goodness. Whitten was an influential congressman who had held office since 1941 when, in a special state election, he had been voted into office at the age of 31. On March 19, 1964, the day before Hamer qualified to run against Whitten and launch her COFO-sponsored campaign, she received a threat from her old place of residence, the W.D. Marlowe plantation, where she had worked as a timekeeper for 18 years before her eviction in 1962. The threat was reported by a friend of Hamer's who still worked and resided on the plantation. The source of the threat was Marlowe's wife, who felt it necessary to notify Hamer that death was imminent. According to Hamer's friend, Mrs. Marlowe warned, Hamer, thinks she's a big woman now, but she'll be killed. On the day after Hamer received her qualification notice, Pap Hamer was fired from yet another job at the local cotton mill. Also, on March 19th, Hamer encountered harassment in her own place of worship. During a mass meeting held at Williams Chapel in Ruleville, Mayor Charles DeRoe interrupted services with an unannounced visit. Some 15 policemen, 2 reporters, and a police dog accompanied him. The local activist Charles McLaurin requested that the mayor wait until volunteers had taken up a collection. Ignoring McLaurin, DeRoe pointed out Hamer in the congregation and directed the reporters to take a picture of her. The mayor then exited the church immediately. McLaurin followed DeRoe outside to take his picture, but the mayor grabbed the camera and went back into the church. He told the congregation that no harm would be done to them if they did not try what McLaurin had attempted. Soon after Hamer qualified to run for office, the telephone company joined in the harassment. In a 1964 public hearing on the persecution of Mississippi citizens, Hamer spoke about this latest invasion of her privacy. "Not only have I been harassed by the police, I had a call from the telephone operator after I qualified to run as congresswoman. She told me, 'Fannie Lou, honey, you are having a lot of different callers on your telephone. I want to know, do you have any outsiders in your house? You called somebody today in Texas. Who was you calling and where are you going? You had a mighty big bill.'" Hamer reminded the operator that her bill was paid, which implied was the only legitimate concern the phone company should have about her service. The operator repeated her warning about outsiders, referring, of course, to out-of-state civil rights activists. Wow, that is crazy. Hamer's own response to harassment was to speak out and continue working, to stand her ground, partly in recognition that violence was a fact of life for the Jim Crow South, and partly in stubborn refusal to display fear. Hamer often observed, when questioned about living under the constant threat of death, "I've been in hell for 46 years. It doesn't make any difference." On the possibility of death, Hamer declared that she was fully prepared to fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom. Now that is some alliteration for your ass. 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom. Fairly or unfairly, Hamer expected the same persistence and boldness from others. Such was the nature of her response to the case of Maggie Spearman of Ruleville. Uh-oh, what happened to Maggie Spearman, honey? Hold on. Give us the tea. On February 29, 1964, Hamer came to the aid of Spearman, who, like Hamer in 1962, was facing possible eviction if she did not return to the registrar's office and remove her name from the rolls. Spearman was 47 years old and a mother of 6. She was a worker on a plantation owned by Sidra Livingston, who, upon hearing of her registration attempt, approached Spearman and told her he was not going to have his people, workers, doing this. He warned her and others about hanging around Hamer because she was nothing but a troublemaker. Upon hearing about Spearman's situation, Hamer saw her out and asked that she not remove her name. She assured Spearman that in the event of eviction, she would have a home at the Hamer residence. Spearman agreed, and Hamer then began making arrangements with SNCC to assist Spearman and her family. Wow. Hamer's first campaign bid for the 2nd District congressional seat was characterized by both a hectic pace and incessant violence and intimidation. The campaign was one of 6 run by local black leadership that, in part, grew out of SNCC's stoic-hearted voter registration activities in the Deep South since 1961. Hamer's decision to run was also the logical outgrowth of a long-standing personal desire to make change. Although she was soon to be disillusioned, Hamer initially believed that electoral politics could be made to work for black people if the process were inclusive instead of exclusive. To open up the process, she believed that the disenfranchised needed only to follow a formula that included lots of hard work, persistence, courage, and a healthy disrespect for injustice. This necessary but idealistic belief would be tested time and again throughout her public life and caused Hamer a great deal of dismay and bitterness by the end of her political career. Wow. Let me read that again. To open up the process, she believed that the disenfranchised needed only to follow a formula that work, persistence, courage, and a healthy disrespect for injustice. This necessary but idealistic belief will be tested time and again throughout her public life and cause Hamer a great deal of dismay and bitterness by the end of her political career. Hamer launched her campaign in early spring 1964. She had set her sights on an elective office soon after being notified that she was a registered voter back in January 1963. Okay, so she had set her sights on an elective office soon after being notified that she was a registered voter back in 1963. She announced her decision to run in a speech delivered on March 19, 1964 in Ruleville. 2 days later, she was in Greenwood addressing a Freedom Day mass meeting. Between March 22nd and April 28th, Hamer traveled throughout much of the Delta, addressing rallies in Mound Bayou, Shelby, Cleveland, Charleston, Clarksdale, and Marks, Mississippi. At a campaign meeting in Clarksdale on April 1st, Hamer told a group of supporters that she wanted to go to Washington to right the wrongs committed by the 23-year incumbent Whitten. Her campaign slogan was "Justice Today for all Mississippians." In partial reference to her eviction and firing, Hamer also described her run for office as an attempt to regain what belonged to her. She exhorted all her supporters to help fight Jamie Whitten so we can bring democracy to this country. Not surprisingly, Hamer ran a campaign with a shoestring budget. There were none of the typical campaign paraphernalia or buttons and bumper stickers. Hamer ran for office on mass rally speeches, door-to-door campaigning, and occasional coffee parties. For this reason alone, the Washington Post gave little chance of winning to Hamer and Victoria Gray, another Mississippi activist running for a congressional seat in a nearby district. According to the Post columnist Sue Crump, these women would achieve nothing beyond being the first black women ever to run for Congress from their respective districts. That's dope. That is amazing. So Fannie Lou Hamer and Victoria Gray were among the first black women in Mississippi to ever run for Congress for their respective districts. Although Hamer's campaign was run on a tight budget, there was one line item that was an absolute budgetary necessity. As part of her funding, COFO included a $10,000 harassment fund for Hamer's campaign. Based on its 1963 experiences with running black candidates in the Deep South, particularly Mississippi, COFO expected a high number of arrests and increased violence in response to Hamer's bid for public office. As it turned out, the fund was entirely necessary. In a way, the amount of harassment was related to the local focus of SNCC and Hamer. In the Mississippi Delta, they organized in small towns that individually had little visibility or significance nationally. These small communities were run by state politicians and local officials who felt no accountability to a disenfranchised black electorate or even to white voters who opposed white supremacy. Moreover, often in these small towns, those who were in charge of keeping law and order were the same ones who wreaked havoc on black communities involved in civil rights activities, leaving black citizens nowhere to turn for protection. Thus, along with a vicious racist climate, tyranny and social custom encouraged harassment and reprisals. Members of Hamer's campaign staff were routinely taken into custody, subjected to abuse, and forced to defend themselves against trumped-up charges. Such was the fate of two young SNCC workers, George Green and Julius Samstein, as reported in a letter from Julian Bond, SNCC's communications director, to Jamie Whitten, Hamer's opponent. On Friday night, March 20th, the two SNCC workers were pulled over by the police. Before taking the two into custody, one policeman struck Green in the ribs and stomachs with a pistol. Upon arriving at the jailhouse, the two were detained without being allowed to access a telephone. Authorities fingerprinted them the following morning, and Mayor DeRoe informed them that they were being held as suspects in a number of burglaries that had occurred in the area. He added later that while they were only suspects in these crimes, they were definitely being charged with violating the town's curfew law. Green, who was driving when the two were pulled over, faced the additional charge of going through a stop sign, which Green and Samstein denied ever existed. The two were released after paying a $10 fine for their alleged infractions. Sometimes the harassment prompted by Hamer's bid resulted in mass arrests of voter registration workers, whose efforts were certainly necessary campaign work if Hamer was to have any real chance of winning. The intimidation that accompanied Hamer's campaign was part of a series of incidents associated primarily with SNCC's voter registration work since the organization's initial foray into the Delta. In another letter to Representative Whitten, the SNCC chairman John Lewis wrote that a March 31st, 1964 Greenwood incident marked an intensification of harassment since Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, a Negro of Ruleville, qualified to run against you in the June 2nd primary. In that event, 14 voter registration workers were arrested as they protested against the denial of the vote to Negroes, referring to a United States Department of Justice suit against Greenwood and Lafleur County officials that charged them with intimidation and interference with blacks wishing to vote. Lewis wrote that the arrest of the 14 today compounds further violation of criminal statute Title 18, Section 594 of the United States Code. In his letter to Whitten, Lewis mentioned his appeal to President Lyndon Johnson and Attorney General Robert Kennedy to make voter intimidation and interference with voter registration activity a federal crime. When the ballots for the Mississippi congressional primary were in and counted, Hamer had lost by a whopping margin, 35,218 votes, 621 votes. Of the 6 black candidates running statewide, Hamer received the least number of votes, while the other 5, all of whom lost, each received at least 1,000 votes. This outcome is partly attributable to the nature of political repression in the 2nd District and all Delta, predominantly rural and black district. It is also attributable to the dire state of political affairs for blacks throughout the entire state. In 1964, only 6.6% or 25,000 of the state's more than 400,000 eligible black voters were registered. For this reason, none of the candidates, including Hamer, thought they had a real chance of winning in this particular election. Nonetheless, many regarded their campaigns as opportunities to introduce to the state's electorate important political issues that were hitherto unraised, such as poverty, racial discrimination, violence, and disenfranchisement. As for the entire nation, theirs were campaigns to expose the unconstitutional denial of the vote to Mississippi's Negro and lower class whites. While there was never any expectation of victory, SNCC was pleased about the outcome, especially in light of the opposition's 11th hour efforts to ensure that Mississippi blacks would stay away from the polls. On the eve of the election, federal U.S. District Court Judge Harold Cox had issued a restraining order in a last-ditch effort to circumvent a recently passed Senate bill that banned poll tax requirements in federal elections. Cox's restraining order targeted those election officials dispatched to enforce the bill. As for the larger meaning of Hamer's election, a few key SNCC members underscored Hamer's local influence as a powerful resource. Among the topics discussed in a SNCC meeting held June 9, 1964, were the significance of Hamer's campaign and the effectiveness of blacks in electoral politics, in particular the Democratic Party. Ivanhoe Donaldson opened the discussion. He asked, "Is it important to run a Mrs. Hamer in the political structure just to be part of the political? Is it important to run a Mrs. Hamer in the political structure just to be part of? If we are working in a program which is completely controlled by those working against us, what is the point of working within the Democratic Party? It is not a radical tool." I know some people that feel like that. Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, a SNCC administrative assistant and gifted logistician, logic and statistician, logistician. Oh my goodness. Logistician then spoke to Hamer's special significance as a political candidate. The candidacy of Mrs. Hamer has value in that she is able to articulate the grievances of Mississippi Negroes. This isn't necessarily true of Mrs. Amelia Boynton. Replying to both Donaldson's and Robertson's observations, the reserved Bob Moses reassured the others that the Young Freedom Democratic Party and SNCC were in no danger of being sucked into the Democratic Party. Among other reasons, Hamer's authenticity and mass appeal precluded this. He reminded them, when Mrs. Hamer talks, she speaks of her life. She concretizes abstract problems for her peers. He even advised about the emerging class tensions around her involvement. He said, note that Jackson Negroes are embarrassed that Mrs. Hamer is representing them. She is too much of a representative of the masses. Here, the question of human dignity is crucial. In his customary way, Moses illuminated Hamer's growing importance to local civil rights developments, particularly the emergence of a grassroots political party, soon to be called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Also MFDP, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP. He perceptively located her appeal in her uncanny ability to give collective meaning to her individual struggles. Moreover, he recognized that her popularity was directly related to her ideological and organizational distance from middle-class, established leaders and politicians, that is, her status as an outsider in relation to out-of-touch mainstream affairs and personalities. In his analysis of Hamer's candidacy, Moses implied that Hamer articulated a perspective and demonstrated a way of being politically that presumably safeguarded the Freedom Democrats from being sucked into the Democratic Party. That was an important consideration for SNCC, which deemed the MFDP a precious component of its overall program in Mississippi. And MFDP stood for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Moses, in his statement, outlined a role for Hamer that was crucial for SNCC's program, MFDP's success, and the liberation of everyday folks in the Delta. This was probably a much larger role than ever Hamer had in mind by spring 1964. In reality, this conquered responsibility was part expectation and part reality. Even the usually level-headed, reserved Bob Moses tended to blur the distinction between what Hamer was actually doing and the immensity of her mobilizing potential. The excitement that SNCC members felt about Hamer's candidacy caused them to define and encourage a role for Hamer that was being shaped as she lived it. It is equally telling that in defining Hamer's character and political role, Ivanhoe Donaldson referred to a Mrs. Hamer as much an allusion to a character type as it was a sign of respect. For some, Hamer was a category in addition to being a person. Oddly enough, as her charismatic personality was attracting attention, she was simultaneously being made invisible by the categorizing of her persona. This, too, was an acknowledgement of her powerful character and the degree to which the strength of her movement was measured and judged by the strength of its individual leaders, even for an organization that, in theory, was so vehemently opposed to dominant individual leaders. The violence and threats of violence in the days following the June 2nd election were intense and widespread. In spite of SNCC's commitment to nonviolent resistance, some members found it necessary to keep weapons in the office to protect the lives of those under threat. People like Hamer, Moses, and Aaron Henry, and NAACP activists and local pharmacists. In a June 10, 1964 report filed from the 2nd Congressional District in Mississippi, James Jones, Charlie Cobb, Charles McLaurin, Hamer's campaign manager and putative right-hand man, and Lawrence Guyot all spoke to the issues of weapons in the SNCC office. Jones noted that the organization's concern for safety originated in March 1964. On March 24, a cross was burned near the office and they received phone threats. The decision was made to protect the people around the office and to prevent people from breaking in and bombing it. According to Cobb, concerning guns in the office, they were there for two reasons. One, people who are breaking in for food and clothes. Two, whites are organizing in vigilante groups. A truckload of guns was stopped in Clinton, Illinois, and the feeling is that the truck was originally headed for Mississippi. Amzie Moore was told by a white that he Mrs. Hamer, Moses, and Aaron Henry was slated to be killed. Charles McLaurin chimed in, throughout the 2nd District, people are arming themselves. Guyot then added, also, the sheriff rides around and asks people not to house summer project workers and tell them not to repeat the conversations to Mrs. Hamer. Maintaining weapons for defensive purposes was not uncommon among SNCC workers and within households that sponsor SNCC field workers and projects. Okay? Stay prepared, stay strapped up. We don't come to be violent, but if you come fucking with us, we got something for you. Maintaining weapons for defensive purposes was not uncommon among SNCC workers, and within households that sponsor SNCC field workers and projects. Those devoted to nonviolent direct action understood that their political reality outweighed their stated political strategy. Let me read that again. Those devoted to nonviolent direct action understood that their political reality outweighed their stated political strategy. That is a good quote. I'm going to have to post that. Like, we know what we come to do, but we also know how y'all act. So we ain't going to be dumb and ill prepared and just be getting shot up when we could be defending ourselves because we have legal rights to bear arms. Carrying a gun could mean the difference between life and death in remote communities where protective law enforcement was virtually non-existent for black citizens and where politically motivated hate crimes, sometimes perpetuated by law enforcement officials themselves, went unchecked. In late 1964, the Ruleville community experienced a brief reign of terror when anti-civil rights forces delivered a disturbing message. On June 24th, whites rolled around the black community throwing bottles at homes and cars. At least 7 of these incidences were reported to the local police, who never responded back to any of the calls. On June 25th, at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, someone hurled a Molotov cocktail at the steps of Ruleville's Williams Chapel, Hamer's church, and a frequent site of mass meetings and voter registration classes. This prompted a few male activists with shotguns to rush over to Hamer's house to protect her. Hamer, of course, kept her own guns for moments like this. Fortunately for local movement participants and congregants, the damage was minimal, thanks to the quick response from a volunteer firefighting force of black citizens. 2 of the structure steps at its front entrance were charred. Apparently, the culprit or culprits intended to blow up the entire building. Investigators located 8 bags of gasoline around the church. The attack was the 4th of its kind in 10 days throughout the state. In late July 1964, a rock was thrown through the car window of Hamer's brother, Joe Townsend. His crime? He too had participated in the movement by opening up his home to movement workers, and it probably did not help matters that he was Fannie Lou's sibling. While the violence at the end of spring in Mississippi had much to do with the black campaigns in the election, it was also due to the ambitious Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, a season-long campaign of voter registration activity, community work, educational programs, and other efforts aimed at making life better for blacks in Mississippi. The summer of 1964 was arguably the most active and attention-getting summer of the civil rights movement. The most controversial aspect of the Freedom Summer Plan was the decision to involve an estimated 1,000 volunteers from the North, mainly students, a great many of whom were white. The movement had considered their presence necessary to attract federal attention, especially against harassment. For so long, blacks had been victims of violence, yet their experiences were not considered serious enough to warrant a federal intervention. Reluctantly, the decision was made to include Northern students in spite of the potential dangers, particularly as it concerned white women students and all the Southern taboos associated with their presence among black men. This later issue had Hamer remarkably flustered at the beginning of Freedom Summer. Hamer's worry about the white women's participation dated back to the Freedom Summer training sessions in Oxford, Ohio, held in June. She wondered about the women's youth as well as their race. One day during that summer, Hamer observed a carload full of white female volunteers circling her neighborhood, and she grew irate. The message had already reached her from an old white associate in town. Fannie Lou, the town is getting upset. There's going to be real trouble if those girls aren't careful. As she stood on her porch watching the women ride around the neighborhood, she told Pap they're going past the Freedom Summer Community Center again. That's the 3rd time those white women have passed this house in the last hour. Hamer was certainly not the only one disturbed by volunteers' irresponsible behavior. A number of individuals in SNCCs, black and white, women and men, frequently noted in meetings and later in personal remembrances the problems caused by interracial mingling, especially between white women and black men. A few former activists and movement scholars still debate the extent to which this issue was more exaggeration than reality. In Southern contexts where perception nearly always equaled reality, this debate seems to miss the point. The mere appearance of impropriety was enough, and Hamer reacted strongly to this fact of Jim Crow life. She and others feared that clear violation of Southern race-sex taboos was just begging for a violent reaction that would stifle the movement. In Hamer's case, elements of her family's sexual history probably spill over into her understanding and appreciation of such danger. From her grandmother's experience, Hamer knew that the mixing of race and sex in the South was a recipe for many things dangerous and unpleasant. One day, Hamer's worry and concern uncharacteristically got to be too much for her. In a conversation with Charles McLaurin, Hamer ranted, "Those cars out here cruising up and down looking so hard is full of women." Then she went into a tirade. "McLaurin, I spent a whole week with those girls in Ohio. I told them frankly what they had to expect, that just being in the Delta was going to be a red flag to the whites, let alone living here in the quarter," Ruleville's black section, "where when you ain't working, I'd say, stay inside. Don't go wandering into town. It's asking for trouble. I told them and told them. It ain't going to be like home. They're good kids and they seem to understand, but they get down here and nobody's setting their house on fire. So they act like they visiting their boyfriends on a college weekend." Let me read that again. "They're good kids and they seem to understand, but they get down here and nobody's setting their house on fire, so they act like they're visiting their boyfriends on college weekend." Hamer was especially alarmed at the consequences that these women's behavior would have for black men in Ruleville and the outcome of the movement. If some whites laid hands on one of them young girls, every Negro man in Ruleville will be in trouble. That kind of trouble kills people in Mississippi. And what will become of the movement then? Hamer's special concern for black men reflected her realistic understanding of who was most endangered by interracial liaisons. Ooh. Yes, yes, and yes. It was acknowledgement of the racial and sexual hierarchy that determined blame and punishment in cases where race and sex taboos were violated. She knew that white Southern men deemed women prized possessions that Southern chivalry required them to honor and protect, particularly from the animalistic, rapacious sexual appetites of black men. Her family history told her that the opposite was not true of black female and white male liaisons. Conceivably, this too accounted for her anger. After Winona, it usually took a great deal to rattle Hamer. Documents and oral histories detailing Hamer's participation in the movement rarely indicate an intense level of panic or nervousness on her part, even though she exhibited the range of common human emotions from time to time. Publicly, she usually displayed only anger in extreme form, not worry or fear. Yet her expressions of concern over white female involvement in the Freedom Summer were rare displays of emotion. She watched the women's every move and grew incensed with each violation of taboos. "It's just as if I never said nothing to them at Oxford. They sit out under trees in the backyard playing cards with the Negro boys while that backyard faces the hospital. Or they stand around in front of the front in groups chatting and laughing. Some of them even wave at cars as they drive by. They cut through white property to get to town. They go to town to buy curls and cokes." In exasperation, Hamer finally admitted to McLaurin that she was worried sick. She was thoroughly convinced that all of his life in the American South just wasn't real for them yet. In a fit of desperation, she ended the conversation by declaring, "Then, if they can't obey the rules, call their mothers and tell them to send down their sons instead." Clearly, the naive conduct of some white women volunteers left her agitated as never before. Ironically, during Freedom Summer, race and sex, the deepest, most personal sources of Hamer's political passion, converged in a way that left her worn, worried, and doubtful, if only temporarily. Violation and injustice around racial and sexual matters usually had the impact of motivating and emboldening Hamer, even as they angered and pained her. But her Freedom Summer experience with some white women left Hamer wavering between disbelief and profound disquietude. I have no word for this word is. I have never seen this word. Disquietude. I don't think I'm saying it right. And this was not simply in response to the behavior of a group of ingenious young adults. As Hamer reacted to the women, she was also responding to the weighty and complex place of race and sex in her personal life history, as well as that for all Black Mississippi. So there's still a few more pages to this chapter, about 5 or 6. So that was already lengthy enough. I'm going to stop here, page 76, and we're going to pick up for part 2 of chapter 4 another time. I appreciate you all for tuning in. Peace, love, and light.